Close your eyes and let the map of the modern world dissolve into a soft silver mist. We are traveling to a village so small, so hidden within the creases of time, that history itself almost forgot to whisper its name. This is Domrémy, a place where the only clock was the heartbeat of the earth, and the only music was the rhythmic sigh of the wind through fields of ancient barley. In this forgotten cradle of France, a story began that would eventually shake the foundations of thrones and rediscover the lost soul of a people. It is a chronicle not of a seasoned general or a grand strategist, but of a young girl who possessed a strength that did not come from steel, but from a quiet, unwavering faith. While the rest of France burned under the weight of broken crowns and iron storms, this quiet cradle remained still. For nearly 100 years, the land beyond these hills had been a tapestry of shifting borders and stolen harvests, a nation holding its breath for a savior it could not yet imagine. The air of the era was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the heavy, lingering shadow of an uncrowned king. Here, in the deep green valleys of the northeast, a teenage girl with rough hands and a soul full of starlight was waiting for a calling that no one else could hear. She was not a queen, nor a knight, but she was a miracle destined to wake a dying nation from its long, cold nightmare. Before the banners were raised, before the smoke of the battlefield clouded the sky, there was only the profound silence of a father's garden. History has a way of choosing the most unexpected vessels for its most sacred moments, opting for the shepherdess over the soldier, the child over the commander. She did not seek the weight of a sword, yet she carried a conviction that would eventually light the way for an entire kingdom. In the stillness of this night, she is not yet a martyr or a saint. She is simply Joan, a daughter of the soil, standing at the threshold of a destiny that feels as vast as the midnight sky. As you settle deeper into your blankets, imagine the soft, rhythmic rustle of a heavy silk banner catching a gentle evening breeze. It is a sound of absolute protection, a fabric of peace rippling like a slow wave in the dark. Feel the tension of the present hour melting away, replaced by the cool, comforting pressure of a legacy that has endured for 5 centuries. There is no urgency in this journey, only the gradual unfolding of a light that burned bright enough to change the world without ever losing its inner quiet. The embers of the past are glowing softly now, inviting you to let go and wander through the silvered corridors of time. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade into a soft, indistinct blur. The noise of the day is falling away, leaving only the steady, calming pulse of a journey that began with a single faithful heartbeat. We are leaving the lights of the city behind, drifting toward the flickering candles of a distant century where the veil between the earth and the heavens was thin and translucent. Let your mind rest upon the borders of a quiet village where the grass is damp with dew and the stars are keeping watch over a sleeping girl. Let us travel back now, past the monuments and the myths, to the very place where the silence first began to speak. Nestled in the gentle, mist-covered valleys of northeastern France, there existed a world where the earth itself dictated the pace of every living soul. This was Domrémy, a sanctuary of green hills and ancient stones, a place so quiet that you could hear the soft, secret dialogue between the wind and the willow trees long before you saw another human being. Here, the landscape did not merely exist, it breathed, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic vitality that had remained unchanged for generations. To step into this valley was to step out of the frantic, jagged stream of time and into a deep, limestone-filtered peace, where the only requirements of the soul were to listen, to breathe, and to belong. In this peaceful setting, the seasons were not just cold markers on a calendar, but the very architects of daily life, shaping the sounds and the silence of the village with a master's hand. When the icy grip of winter finally loosened, the valley would awaken to the bright, melodic song of the river Meuse, its waters swollen and crystalline with the heavy gift of melted snow. You can almost feel the cool, damp air of a March morning, smelling of wet earth, early moss, and the promise of life, as the river rushes over smooth river stones in a constant bubbling lullaby. It was a time of waking, of the first pale green shoots pushing through the thawing mud, and of the distant, echoing call of shepherds returning to the higher pastures, as the world turned soft again. As the year tilted toward the sun, the valley transformed into a vast golden ocean. In the height of summer, immense fields of barley and wheat would sway in unison, a shimmering expanse of amber that seemed to ripple like the surface of a calm, warm sea. The air would grow heavy and sweet, perfumed with the scent of sun-warmed hay and wild clover, vibrating with the low, industrious hum of honeybees lost in their work. During these long, drowsy afternoons, the village of Domrémy felt suspended in a golden amber of its own, a place where the shadows of clouds moved lazily across the rolling hills, and the world felt infinitely safe, infinitely whole, and far removed from the clamor of men. Then, with the inevitable turn of the wheel, the vibrant colors would fade into the stark, clean beauty of winter. Snow would descend upon the thatched roof cottages in a graceful, hushed descent, blanketing the earth in a profound and holy silence. In these months, the world was reduced to the comforting crackle of a hearth fire and the soft, muffled padding of boots on fresh powder. The river Meuse would grow quiet beneath a thin veil of ice, and the trees would stand like silver sentinels against a bruised purple sky. It was a time of deep inwardness, of long nights spent in the radiating warmth of the home, where the silence was not an absence of sound, but a dense, velvety presence of peace. Joan was a child of these rhythms, her spirit slowly forged in the slow-moving kiln of the French countryside. While other children might have been restless or loud, she found a strange and beautiful companionship in the textures of her daily chores. Imagine the rhythmic, hypnotic whir of the wooden spinning wheel as she worked, the raw wool a sound as steady. Feel the radiating warmth of the stone oven as she helped her mother, Isabel, knead and bake the daily bread, the kitchen filling with the yeasty, life-affirming aroma of the earth's simplest sustenance. There was a sacredness in these repetitive motions, a deep meditation found in the fetching of water, and the tending of animals that taught her how to be still, even when her hands were busy. In Domrémy, formal education was a rarity, a luxury for those in distant, noisy cities, and Joan never learned the art of the quill or the meaning of ink on parchment. Yet, she was far from unlearned. She was a scholar of the natural world and a graduate of the quiet liturgy. Long before she could have passed a single written sentence, Joan had learned to decipher the intricate songs of the saints and the complex, beautiful scripture of the seasons. She memorized the tolling of the church bells, knowing exactly which note signaled the Angelus and which called for a soul to rest. She absorbed the ancient stories of martyrs told by the village priest, weaving their courage into the very fabric of her own developing heart. Her eyes would often close in the middle of a sunlit field, not in sleep, but in a state of profound, active listening. She heard the divine in the rustle of the oak leaves and the sacred in the lowing of the cattle at dusk. To Joan, the world was a thin place where the whispers of heaven were constantly filtering through the ordinary tasks of a farm girl's life. She was being prepared not by dusty books or complex maps, but by the quietude of the earth and the steady, reliable grace of the valley. She was a vessel being hollowed out by the silence of Domrémy, made ready to hold a message that would one day command the attention of kings and change the destiny of a nation. Every day was a living prayer, and every prayer was a thread connecting her to the ancestors who had walked these same muddy paths for 1,000 years. The village of Domrémy, with its simple farmers and its humble stone church, was her entire universe, a small, protected garden where her faith could grow deep and strong, undisturbed by the storms of the wider world. It was a place of rough hands and reverent hearts, where the most important thing a person could possess was a soul that knew how to be truly quiet. As you linger in this pastoral dream, feel yourself becoming part of the landscape, as rooted as the ancient oaks that stood guard over the village fields. The air is still, the light is soft, and the world is at rest. There is nothing you need to do, and nowhere else you need to go. You are safe within the gentle embrace of the valley, lulled by the timeless music of the river and the golden fields. But even in the most perfect of sanctuaries, change is a quiet visitor. In the familiar corners of her father's garden, amidst the wild herbs and the creeping shadows of the afternoon, a different kind of light was beginning to wait, a light that did not come from the sun, and a voice that did not belong to the wind. In the heart of Domrémy, where the long shadows of the great wood touched the edges of the tilled fields, Joan moved with a quietude that set her apart from every other child in the valley. She was not a child of loud laughter, frantic running, or wild, wandering games. Her spirit seemed anchored to a frequency that others could not quite tune into, a low and steady hum of peace. While her peers played in the bright, splashing shallows of the river Meuse, or chased the wind through the high, golden summer grass, Joan was often found in the hushed, cool interior of the village church. She wasn't distant out of sadness or fear, but rather out of a deep, innate preoccupation with the invisible world, a sense that the air around her was filled with a presence that required her full attention. Her parents, Jacques and Isabelle, noticed early on that their youngest daughter possessed a heart that was already in a private, gentle conversation with something far beyond the wooden gates of their humble farm. The church of Saint Remigius stood as a sturdy, stone sentinel in the center of her small world, just a short, familiar walk from the dark family home. For Joan, this was the ultimate sanctuary, a place where the heavy, iron-bound oak doors functioned as a barrier, muffling the sounds of the suffering, war-torn world outside. Within these thick, ancient limestone walls, time did not move in minutes or hours, but in a steady, rhythmic flicker of candlelight and the slow, hypnotic dance of dust motes caught in the shafts of stained glass light. She would slip quietly inside, her small leather boots making almost no sound on the uneven stone floor, and find her accustomed place in the deep stillness of the nave. Hush! There she would kneel for hours, her presence as natural, as unmoving, and as timeless as the statues of the saints that watched over her with their painted wooden eyes. Others in the village began to notice this singular devotion, speaking of it among themselves not with judgment or suspicion, but with a gentle, reverent awe. They saw a young girl, barely out of the soft edges of childhood, who seemed to find more genuine comfort in the cold silence of the altar than in the boisterous comforts of the family hearth. To Joan, the church was not a cold, imposing, or frightening building. It was a warm, breathing extension of her own soul, a place where her spirit could finally expand to its full height. She loved the tactile, sensory reality of her faith, the smooth, cool texture of the stone floors beneath her knees, the rough grain of the wooden pews, and the faint, sweet, grounding scent of beeswax and old incense that lingered forever in the high, dark rafters. These tiny details provided her with a profound sense of spiritual security, a feeling that she was tucked safely away in a hidden pocket of the universe, where nothing, no soldier, no king, and no storm could ever truly reach her. As she knelt in the dim amber light, her eyes would soften and close, and her lips would begin to move in gentle, barely audible whispers that only the attentive ears of heaven could catch. These were not rehearsed, hollow recitations or the frantic pleas of a frightened child. They were intimate, slow-moving dialogues. A daughter of the soil sharing the small, everyday weight of her life with the infinite. She prayed for the safety of her 5 siblings, for the strength of her father's hands in the fields, and for the peace of a France she had never seen, but felt breaking like glass in the distance. In these long moments of sacred stillness, the chaos of the 100 Years' War felt like a distant, harmless storm held back by the sheer, luminous power of her innocence and the immovable strength of the stones surrounding her. Imagine the profound, enveloping peace of that setting, the way the flickering orange flames of the votive candles cast long, swaying shadows that climbed the arched ceiling like silent guardians. The air inside the church always felt a few degrees cooler than the world outside, a refreshing, holy balm against the midday heat of the summer sun or the weary toil of the spinning wheel. Joan found her truest identity here, in the long intervals between the tolling of the bell. She was a dedicated student of the silence, learning to wait with a quiet patience that few adults in the world ever master. She was not looking for a sign or seeking a grand golden destiny. She was simply resting, as a child rests in the arms of a parent. In the presence of a grace, she felt as surely as the warmth of the sun on her skin during the harvest. This was her fortress of faith, a place of safety that no English army or complex political dispute could ever hope to penetrate. The slow rhythms of her private prayers matched the rhythms of the earth she tended during the day, creating a seamless, beautiful life where work and worship were one and the same. Whether she was fetching water from the cool village well, or helping her mother knead the heavy dough for the morning bread, the stillness of the church traveled with her, a quiet, unshakable center in a rapidly turning world. Her hands were rough and calloused from the labor of the farm, but her spirit remained polished, clear, and bright, a mirror, reflecting a light that was beginning to gather just beyond the horizon of her understanding. The village of Domrémy, though small and seemingly insignificant, was a microcosm of a nation in desperate need of healing, and Joan was the quiet, steady heart at its very center. She did not possess wealth, and she did not carry a noble title, but she held within her a profound, unshakable sense of belonging to something eternal and kind. The neighbors who caught glimpses of her kneeling in the gathering dusk didn't see a future general or a warrior of legends. They saw a girl who was perfectly at home in the light of God. This innocence was her greatest armor, a purity of purpose that made the encroaching shadows of the world seem thin, fragile, and ultimately insignificant. As you drift with her now into this state of sacred stillness, feel the weight of your own world beginning to soften and dissolve. The stone walls are strong and ancient, the candles are burning low and steady, and the silence is a soft, heavy blanket draped over the shoulders of the evening. There is no fear allowed here, only a deep, abiding sense of absolute protection. Joan is at peace, her heart beating in perfect time with the ancient, steady pulse of the sanctuary. She is prepared for whatever the future may hold, because she has mastered the art of being still. The world outside the heavy doors may be loud with the clatter of iron swords and the desperate cries of kings, but inside this singular moment, there is only the soft breath of a girl and the eternal presence of the divine. The afternoon light began to shift subtly, stretching long golden fingers across the wooden pews and the dusty stone floor of the nave. The silence of the church, usually so predictable, deep, and calm, started to hum with a new and vibrant kind of energy, a warm, living pressure that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Joan did not open her eyes immediately, but she felt a profound change in the atmosphere, a soft, radiant weight that signaled the approaching end of her ordinary, quiet life. One afternoon, while she sat in the deep stillness of her father's garden near the church, the air itself began to glow with a light that had no source in the sky, and the silence was broken by a voice that changed everything forever. The afternoon was heavy with the golden, honeyed scent of wild herbs and sun-drenched earth, a time when the world feels suspended in a warm, amber haze. It began not with a thunderclap or a sudden tremor, but with a summer wind passing through the tall, rhythmic grass of her father's garden. Joan was 13, a season of life where the world still feels vast, mysterious, and porous, and she was alone in the deep emerald green of the orchard near the village church. The air seemed to hold its breath. The distant lowing of cattle and the dry, percussive chirping of cicadas suddenly faded into a singular, pressurized silence, a silence so thick, so holy, and so profound that it felt like being deep underwater, where every earthly sound is muffled by the immense weight of grace. Then the light arrived. It was not the harsh, yellow glare of the midday sun, but a sudden shimmering radiance that seemed to bloom from the very center of the air itself. It was a warmth that did not burn, a glow that felt intimately familiar, as if she had been waiting for this specific hue of celestial gold since the very first moment she was born. In the heart of this brilliance, the garden of Domrémy dissolved into a soft, silvered blur, and three figures of staggering beauty and solemn grace stood before her in the radiant silence. They did not touch the grass. They inhabited the space with a weightless authority that made the ancient oaks surrounding them seem fragile and fleeting by comparison. The first was Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior prince of heaven, his presence a breathtaking blend of ironclad strength and unshakable peace. His voice was calm, firm, and resonant, moving through her not as a sound heard by the physical ears, but as a deep vibration felt in the very marrow of her bones. Beside him stood Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, their faces glowing with a wisdom that spanned centuries, their aura smelling of lilies, cool incense, and the clean bracing air of high mountain peaks. They did not speak in the hurried, jagged, or impatient tones of men. Their words were like smooth river stones dropped into a deep, still pool heavy with eternal meaning, clear as glass, and perfectly spaced within the silence. Imagine the sheer crystalline awe of that moment, Joan, a girl who had never left the borders of her small, quiet village, was now standing at the singular intersection of the earthly and the divine. The saints looked upon her not with the coldness of statues, but with a profound, searing love that made her feel seen and understood in a way that words could never fully describe. They brought a message that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. They revealed to her a divine mission of impossible proportions, that she, this quiet shepherdess with no sword, no training, and no title, was chosen by God to drive the English out of her homeland, to lead an army of hardened men, and to crown the rightful king at the sacred cathedral of Reims. To hear such things at 13 is to feel the entire universe shifting and realigning beneath your feet. But the voices did not command in harsh or frightening tones. They guided her with a patient, solemn grace that wrapped around her like a warm, protective cloak in the cold of night. They told her that she was to remain faithful, pure, and steady, for the path ahead would be paved with trials and fire, but she would never walk a single step of it alone. The message settled into her heart with a burning, unshakable certainty, a weight that felt more real and more permanent than the stone garden walls or the church spire visible in the distance. These figures were not ghosts or figments of a dream. To Joan, they were as solid and as present as the wind that stirred the barley fields, unseen but unmistakably there. As you drift deeper into this vision, feel the hypnotic, rhythmic pull of that celestial radiance. The Garden of Domrémy has become a thin place, a sacred portal where the impossible is being whispered into existence. The light is soft, all-encompassing, and gentle a velvet glow that lulls the senses and stills the frantic mind. There is a profound sense of transcendence here, a feeling of being lifted high above the small, daily concerns of the world and into a grand narrative that spans the ages. Joan stood in the center of this brilliance, her rough, calloused hands clasped in reverence, her eyes wide with a brilliant reflection of heaven's own light. She did not seek glory, and she did not ask for power. She simply listened with a heart that had been hollowed out by years of prayer, ready to be filled with this holy fire. The voices were familiar now, their presence a source of immense, grounding comfort rather than fear. When they spoke, it felt as though she were remembering a language she had known long before she was ever born. They didn't promise her safety, and they never said the journey across France would be easy. But they gave her something far more valuable, a sense of absolute, divine purpose. She was no longer just a daughter of Jacques and Isabelle. She was a messenger, a servant of the highest, and a spark that would soon ignite the cold heart of a nation. The mission was a heavy burden for such young shoulders, yet the grace that accompanied it made the load feel as light as a feather caught in a gentle updraft. The visitation lasted for what felt like an eternity compressed into a single, perfect heartbeat. When the light finally began to recede, it did not vanish all at once, but faded like the last soft embers of a magnificent sunset, leaving behind a lingering warmth in the air and a permanent, glowing embers in Joan's spirit. The garden returned to its ordinary state. The cicadas resumed their rhythmic song, the sheep bleated in the distance, and the summer wind continued its journey through the barley. But for Joan, nothing in this world would ever be ordinary again. She carried the secret of the saints within her, a private sanctuary of fire and light that she would guard for years as she waited for the appointed time to act. As you settle into the profound, heavy quiet that follows this encounter, feel the awe of it resonating within your own spirit. The world is a place of deep mystery, and sometimes, in the most hidden and humble of gardens, the divine chooses to speak in whispers. You are safe in this realization, held by the same steady, watching grace that guarded Joan. The night is vast, peaceful, and still, and the story is unfolding with a slow, deliberate beauty. Joan remained in the garden long after the figures were gone, her spirit vibrating with the echoes of heaven's command. She knew that the day would eventually come when she would have to leave the safety of the valley. For once heaven speaks your name, you do not ignore the call. Heaven had spoken. The vision was etched in light, and now, the girl from Domrémy must prepare to rise and meet her destiny. Nogoila, bunfantish, vahiu, shen, kuyen saucho, msc5 turtle. Twe, SITP. Trung, vago, 6, duye, 3, twom, dai, hypnagogic, tur, ta, te, tshie, teen. 1, da. Sosan Dagan Gia, Critical Review, Tinada Odia, Kachbia, Emma Dio, Zizi. Dai vi cho, ka, kat, doa, dan. No, tip twang, vago, tilling, mong. Jida va a cm, diak, CIA, man, gogem, kup ungi, za. Kao nidum sho, ka duan vogai, shinontiyo, ha em, neti, han yeyoanti. Chun bi bacho, MSC 6. Makong lam inge, get me. TVMU, Kosh BGNC Mo, TIT, Koche, Hansha, Tru, Ahando. Kratch, Bien Diga Nai, Lama Mam, Ezerdishe, Nuhim Nai, Biz, Dinihe, Bitafortia, Bontugem. DJ Nam, Brain Alertness. Top, Nash, ST, Dong, Tat, He, Enashram P, Do, Dis, L, A. Bon, T, Velvet, Nam, Ne, Sekom. Jekich, Tich, Bekas, Tin, Titan, Kalkash, Tina, Teka, SE, Anki, T, Bin, Nab, Shro, Do, DUAB, DRC, Tier 5, Siro Kiti, Tui, Se, MR, An, Term, Katmo, TISA, Tau, D, SE, Dai, Dea, CN, Vatse, A, TCN, Joan. Tra, Ten, Diak, Hoa, Tan, Shi, Dyanjin, 8, 10. Cientem da de Vaifon, and Happy, Dodiu, Tok 910, 2. Rewrite MSC 5, Terry 910, Target, 5, 0 Chars, 5. Transition, M. The road to the prince, the long season of waiting in the quiet valleys, had finally dissolved, replaced by the cool, sharp clarity of a soul in motion. For years, Joan had guarded the celestial fire within the secret sanctuary of her heart, moving through the familiar, sun-drenched rhythms of Domrémy, while the voices in the garden grew increasingly insistent, like a rising tide of light. But now, the internal peace of her childhood was stretching outward, pulling her away from the safety of the ancient stone church and the radiating warmth of her mother's heart. To leave was not a choice made in haste or rebellion. It was a slow, deliberate rising of the spirit. She looked one last time at the rolling, misty hills and the silver ribbon of the river Meuse, knowing that the girl who walked out of this valley would never truly return to the simple, predictable patterns of the fields. The sleepy village, with its hushed snows and golden barley, was fading into the soft mist of memory, while ahead lay a landscape scarred by the jagged, distant fires of a century-long war. The journey to find the Dauphin, the uncrowned Prince Charles, was a path forged in deep shadow and quiet, unshakable bravery. In the late, biting winter of 1014-29, Joan set out with a small, loyal escort of just a few guards, leaving behind the only world she had ever known to traverse nearly 300 miles of dangerous, enemy-held territory. This was not a grand, loud procession of knights and brass trumpets. It was a ghost-like, silent passage through the dark, frozen veins of France. For 11 days and 11 nights, they rode through dense, tangled forests where the trees stood like skeletal, ancient guardians, and across muddy, forgotten roads that threatened to swallow the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. The air was biting, raw and heavy, smelling of damp earth and the distant, thin wood smoke of burned villages. Yet Joan pressed forward with a preternatural calm that unnerved even the hardened soldiers who rode beside her. In the deep, velvet stillness of those winter nights, the entire world was reduced to a singular, hypnotic, and comforting rhythm. Imagine the steady rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on the frozen ground, a repetitive, mechanical pulse that matched the beating of a determined, faithful heart. There was a strange, almost meditative comfort in that sound, a heartbeat of steel and stone, that carved a safe path through the vast uncertainty of the woods. The darkness was not a void of fear, but a protective, heavy cloak, hiding them from the English patrols that roamed the silent countryside. Joan sat tall and balanced in her saddle, her eyes fixed on the silver horizon, her spirit anchored by the same voices that had once whispered to her in the garden. She was no longer just a peasant girl. She was a traveler moving between two worlds, guided by a quiet, ironclad certainty that the heavens were watching over every slow, rhythmic step. As they moved through the silent fields where battles had once raged and long vanished into the soil, a subtle but significant transformation took place. Joan had set aside her heavy wool skirts for the practical, simple attire of a traveler: short tunics, hosen, and a dark, sturdy cloak. This choice was not a declaration of war or an act of vanity, but a profound reveal of her quiet wisdom and her fundamental need for safety. In a landscape where a lone woman was often a target for the cruel, the desperate, or the lost, this clothing was her secondary armor, a way to move through the world of men without being hindered by its expectations or its many dangers. It allowed her to ride for hours, to sleep on the hard, cold ground, and to maintain her sacred purity as she moved toward her divine appointment. It was the outer manifestation of her inner transition. She was stripping away the layers of her old, quiet life to become the focused vessel the voices require. Feel the heavy, cooling dampness of the night air as it brushes gently against your face. The journey is long, but there is no sense of exhaustion here. Only the steady unfolding purpose of the road. Each league traveled is a layer of doubt falling away into the darkness. Each river crossed is a quiet baptism into her new, luminous identity. Joan was not traveling to plead for a favor. She was traveling to claim a destiny that had already been etched into the stars. The horse's breath misted in the moonlight, rising like ghosts into the trees, and the only other sound was the occasional, lonely hoot of an owl or the rustle of a fox in the winter underbrush. You are safe in this steady, rhythmic movement, held by the same clip-clop that carried Joan across the broken heart of France, moving ever closer to the center of the storm. As the 11th day finally dawned, the rugged terrain began to change. The wild, tangled forests giving way to the structured, stone-laden beauty of the Loire Valley. The air grew slightly warmer and heavier, carrying the faint, metallic scent of a large river and the immense, historical weight of kings. The quiet, muddy roads finally surrendered to the paved, ancient approaches of a great royal stronghold. Ahead, rising out of the gray, morning light like a jagged, imposing crown of stone, the castle of Chinon stood tall and silent against the pale sky. Its massive walls and watchful towers held the future of a broken kingdom, and the man who was too afraid to lead it. Joan adjusted her reins, her gaze steady, clear, and utterly unafraid. The long road from the garden had led her to these very gates, and the girl from Domrémy was finally ready to look a prince in the eye and tell him the truth. The heavy iron-bound gates of Orleans groaned open, not to admit a seasoned conqueror of steel, but to welcome a singular flicker of light in the deepest part of a 7-month-long night. As Joan rode slowly into the city in the late April of 1429, the air was thick, heavy with the cold scent of stagnant river water, damp stone, and the hollow, lingering ache of a collective hunger. The people who lined the narrow, winding cobblestone streets were mere shadows of their former selves, haggard, weary, and draped in the gray, suffocating shroud of despair. For nearly 200 days, they had watched the English fortifications tighten around them like a slow-moving vice. cutting off the lifeblood of the Loire and leaving them to wait for an end that seemed inevitable and cruel. But as the girl in the white armor passed through the threshold, a strange rhythmic electricity began to pulse through the damp, tired air. She was not a traditional commander of men, and she did not speak the jagged, harsh, or impatient language of revenge or strategic slaughter. Instead, Joan spoke of a restored faith, of a divine will that moved slower than the frantic plans of generals, but with the unstoppable, crushing weight of the rising tide. The deep-seated skepticism of the hardened veterans and the loud, distant mockery of the English captains outside the walls began to dissolve, melting away against the steady, quiet, and unshakable fire in her gaze. She did not promise a quick or violent escape. She promised a restoration of the nation's soul. In the flickering, warm torchlight of the city squares, the people of Orleans looked at her, and for the first time in a generation, they dared to breathe a different kind of air, an air that tasted of impossible hope. Imagine the rhythmic, hypnotic preparation for the struggle that lay ahead. There was the steady metallic ring of the blacksmith's hammer as armor was repaired in the dark, the soft, repetitive rustle of grain sacks being distributed to the hollow-eyed hungry, and the constant low and comforting murmur of prayers echoing from the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral of Saint Croix. Joan moved through these preparations with a serene, focused, and almost dreamlike energy, her presence acting as a grounding wire for an entire city on the fragile edge of collapse. She was not preparing for a massacre. She was preparing for a liberation of the spirit. Every movement she made was deliberate and calm. Every word she spoke was a sturdy brick in a new foundation of courage that was being built, moment by slow and steady moment, in the tired hearts of the exhausted defenders. When the time finally came to confront the siege directly, Joan did not reach for a sharpened blade of cold, biting steel. Instead, she reached for her banner, a magnificent, heavy cloth of pure white silk, intricately stitched with golden lilies and the sacred, holy names that had guided her since the Garden of Domrémy. As she rode toward the English strongholds of Les Tourelles, it was this white banner that led the way, fluttering like the vast, silent wings of a great bird against the bruised and smoky sky. She held it high with both hands, her grip steady, calm, easy, and unyielding, even as the chaotic struggle of the world swirled and roared around her. She was a singular focal point of purity amidst the mud and the iron, a white flame that refused to be extinguished by the long shadows of war. In the heat of the conflict, a profound and beautiful reveal emerged from her every action. Though she wore the heavy armor of a soldier and rode at the head of a surging army, Joan once confessed to her closest companions that she loved her banner 40 times more than she ever loved a sword. Her reason was as simple as it was transcendent. The banner carried no blood. It was a weapon of pure spirit, not of torn flesh, a symbol of light that invited their enemy to surrender their hate rather than a blade that demanded they fall in pain. She did not wish to take a single life, but to restore a kingdom's sacred right to exist in peace. To Joan, the banner was a promise that the ultimate victory belonged to heaven, and she was merely the one chosen to hold the light steady until the darkness of the siege finally gave way to the morning. The struggle for Orleans reached its peak under the long, cold shadow of the great stone forts. At one critical point, an enemy arrow found its mark, piercing her shoulder and forcing her, for a brief time, from the field. For a moment, the rhythm of hope faltered, and the old, familiar fears began to creep back into the hearts of the French. But then, through the thick haze of exhaustion and the din of the siege, the white banner rose again, higher than before. Bloodied but completely unbroken, Joan returned to the front lines, her presence a living miracle that defied the physical limits of the human body. The sight of her small, determined, and bathed in that singular, unwavering faith acted like a sudden thunderclap in a silent valley. The English, who had once mocked a peasant girl with such cruelty, now felt a cold, unfamiliar tremor of dread, while the French soldiers surged forward with a strength they had long forgotten they possessed. As the sun began to set on the 8th of May, the unthinkable happened. The English forces, battered not just by arms but by the sheer, luminous, and overwhelming weight of Joan's conviction, began to retreat into the evening mist. The siege was lifted. Imagine the sudden, heavy, and beautiful silence that fell over the battlefield as the last of the enemy columns vanished into the distance. It was a silence that was slowly, rhythmically broken by a sound that the people of Orleans had feared they would never hear again in their lifetime. The bells. One by one, the iron bells of the city's many towers began to swing, sending a deep, resonant, and soul-stirring vibration through the stone walls and into the very soil beneath their feet. The sound of the bells was a soothing, rhythmic balm that washed over the wounded and weary city. They rang out through the clearing smoke, their notes clear, triumphant, and yet carrying a profound, holy peace that settled over the rooftops like a soft blanket. People tumbled out of their homes and into the streets, weeping and embracing, their voices rising in a slow, melodic tide of overwhelming gratitude. Joan rode slowly among them, her white armor stained with the dust of the road and her banner grayed by the smoke. Yet her eyes remained as calm, as steady, and as clear as the winter waters of the Meuse. She did not take a single ounce of credit for the victory. She simply pointed toward the sky, reminding them all that the light had always been there, waiting for them to find the courage to believe in it once more. The long nightmare was finally over, and the city was free to sleep in absolute peace for the first time in a generation. Feel the deep, grounding resonance of those heavy bells in your own chest as you breathe. The smoke of the struggle has drifted far away, replaced by the cool, sweet evening air of the Loire Valley. The city of Orleans is safe now, tucked away under the watchful, shimmering eye of the stars and the lingering, protective glow of the white banner. You are safe here too, held by the same rhythmic certainty that turned the tide of history without ever losing its inner quiet. The victory was not won through anger or noise, but through an unshakable, quiet persistence, a slow, steady flame that eventually consumed the darkness by simply refusing to go out. The world is at rest now, the echoes of the bells fading into a soft, comforting, and hypnotic hum that lulls the spirit into a state of profound inspiration and rest. But even as the people celebrated and the fires were lit for warmth rather than war, Joan's steady gaze was already fixed on a much more distant and difficult horizon. The lifting of the siege was a miraculous beginning, a single spark that had ignited the soul of all of France. But the great mission the voices had given her in the garden was not yet complete. The tide of hope was rising across the kingdom, and she knew in her heart that she must ride its crest before the moment faded back into the shadows. There was still a crown that remained unclaimed, a prince who remained uncertain, and a sacred ritual that remained unperformed. One great, final task remained on the path laid out by the saints, the long, perilous, and sacred journey through enemy lands to reach the ancient, holy towers of Reims. The rhythmic march of the French forces finally slowed as a new silhouette emerged from the silvered horizon. At last, the ancient towers of Reims rose into view, standing tall, silent, and watchful against a pale, vast sky. For centuries, these stone giants had served as the solemn guardians of French history, witnessing the rise of kings and the slow turning of the ages. As the army approached, the city did not bristle with the iron of resistance. Instead, it seemed to open its arms in a quiet, weary wonder. The gates swung wide, welcoming Charles and the girl who had carried his destiny across the broken roads of the kingdom. There was a profound sense of homecoming in the air, a feeling that the land itself was taking a long, deep breath after a century of holding its collective spirit in suspense. Inside the great cathedral of Our Lady of Rheims, the world of muddy battlefields and jagged steel felt like a fading dream. The interior was a forest of stone, where massive pillars reached toward a vaulted ceiling that seemed to touch the very hem of heaven. Preparations for the coronation began in a rhythmic, reverent silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a sacred transformation. Torches were lit along the nave, their warm orange flames casting long, flickering shadows that danced like the ghosts of ancient kings against the cold limestone walls. The air was cool and still, thick with the weight of memory and the soft repetitive echoes of priests arranging sacred garments and polishing silver trumpets for the morrow. Imagine the deep, grounding peace of that sacred space. The light filtered through the high stained glass windows in pools of sapphire, ruby, and gold, painting the dusty air with the colors of a promise kept. Joan moved through the cathedral with a quiet, dusty grace, her white armor reflecting the torchlight like a pale moon. She sought no seat of honor and asked for no crown for herself. She was content to be a witness to the fulfillment of the voices that had first whispered to her in the garden. Every step she took on the hallowed stone floor was a beat of profound fulfillment, a realization that the impossible path from Domrémy had led, inch by faithful inch, to this very altar. On the morning of July 17th, 1429, the cathedral breathed with the life of a nation reborn. The ceremony unfolded with a slow, hypnotic solemnity. You can almost smell the rich, grounding scent of sacred oils and the sweet, heavy drift of frankincense as the Archbishop of Reims prepared to anoint the prince. The ritual was a steady, melodic progression of prayers and vows, a rhythmic weaving of the earthly and the divine. As the crown was finally lowered onto Charles's head, a cheer rose from the crowd, spilling out of the cathedral doors and into the streets like sunlight breaking through a storm. But inside the stone walls, the sound was muffled and soft, a distant tide of joy that only served to deepen the stillness around the altar. In this moment of ultimate triumph, a beautiful reveal settled over the scene. Joan did not stand behind the king as a subordinate, nor did she hide in the shadows of the court. She stood at the very side of the altar, her white silk banner held high and steady. When asked later why her banner was present at the coronation when those of other commanders were not, her reply was as simple as a child's prayer. It had borne the burden. It was quite right that it should have the honor. To Joan, the banner was the true participant in the struggle, a silent companion that had shared every muddy mile and every terrifying charge. Her mission, so vast and so heavy for a girl of 17, was reaching its quiet, luminous peak. Feel the profound, cooling relief of this fulfillment. The weight of the mission has been lifted, replaced by the solemn beauty of a promise realized. The crown rests on the king's head, the oils have been blessed, and the spirit of France has been reclaimed from the edge of ruin. You are safe in this sanctuary of stone and light, lulled by the distant, rhythmic hum of a celebrating city that is finally, truly home. The air is still, the torches are burning steady, and the world feels aligned once more. Joan remained at the altar long after the crowds had thinned, her heart beating in the heavy, satisfied silence of a servant who has finished her work. The bells of Reims continue to toll, their deep, resonant notes vibrating through the cathedral's foundation and into the hearts of everyone who heard them. It was a sound of absolute closure, a rhythmic declaration that the shepherdess had delivered a king to his throne. The light in the cathedral began to soften as the sun dipped lower, the shadows of the pillars stretching across the floor, like long dark fingers. Joan watched the dust motes drift in the fading light, her spirit resting in a state of quiet grace. She had done what heaven asked. She had turned the tide of history with nothing but a banner and a belief. But as the echoes of the coronation began to fade into the evening mist, the atmosphere within the royal court started to shift. The sacred oils were dry, and the crown was secure, but the purity of Joan's mission was beginning to collide with the complicated, cold reality of men. While the people cheered in the streets, the halls of power remained silent and watchful. The king she had crowned was now surrounded by advisors who spoke the language of caution and calculation, a language that had no room for the fire of a peasant girl's visions. In the polished corridors of the new reign, the warmth of the cathedral was already being replaced by a subtle, chilling draught. Behind the tapestries and behind the smiles of the courtiers, a cold wind was beginning to blow. The vibrant, gold-lit echo of the coronation at Reims finally began to fade into the distance, replaced by the damp, heavy gray of a cold stone cell in Rouen. This transition was not a sudden, jarring break, but a slow, rhythmic drifting into a different kind of sanctuary, one forged not of incense, silk, and cheering crowds, but of cold iron and an unyielding, protective silence. Joan sat quietly upon a rough stone bench, the heavy metallic clink of her chains acting as a slow, grounding metronome in the absolute dark of the dungeon. She was only 19 years old, far from the emerald green valleys of Domrémy, and seemingly abandoned by the very king she had crowned. Yet she was not afraid. There was a profound, melancholy peace in her solitude now, a sense that the frantic noise of the world had finally exhausted itself, leaving only the steady, quiet pulse of her own breathing and the enduring, soft presence of the voices that had never once left her side during her long journey. In the cold, vaulted halls of the great tribunal, Joan stood before a vast sea of black robes and watchful, judging eyes. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with the scent of old dry parchment, cold ink, and the suffocating weight of 1,000 complex, earthly laws. Her accusers circled her with jagged, trap-laden questions for hours on end, seeking desperately to catch her in a web of her own words. Yet she answered every one of them with a wisdom that seemed to transcend the centuries. She spoke with a slow, rhythmic clarity, her voice never once rising in anger or faltering in the slightest doubt. It was a hypnotic, beautiful display of grace under immense pressure. A simple girl who had never learned to read or write, yet understood the intricate grammar of the human soul far better than any scholar or bishop in the room. She was no longer defending her life. She was simply bearing a quiet witness to the truth of her mission, her spirit moving as steadily and as powerfully as a deep river through the narrow, dark canyons of the court. During one of the longest and most grueling sessions of the trial, a judge attempted to corner her with a singular question designed to condemn her regardless of her answer. They asked if she knew herself to be in the divine grace of God. A yes would be seen by the court as arrogant pride. A no would be interpreted as a direct confession of sin. But Joan's response was a soft, breathtaking reveal of her pure and uncomplicated faith. She replied quietly, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The entire room fell into a heavy, stunned silence, the kind of silence that occurs only when the earthly mind encounters a crystalline, celestial truth. In that singular moment, the chains, the guards, and the cold stone walls seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving only the luminous transparency of a soul that was already at perfect rest in the infinite. The morning of the end arrived not as a sudden tragedy, but as a final quiet unfolding of a long-written prophecy. As Joan was led slowly to the marketplace of Rouen, she moved with a rhythmic, almost ghostly composure that unnerved the vast crowds and the hardened executioners alike. She wore a simple white dress, her hands were bound, and her head was shorn. Yet she carried within her an inner light that made the rising morning sun seem dim and secondary. She asked for a cross, not a golden, jewel-encrusted one from a grand cathedral, but a simple one fashioned from two rough sticks of wood by a kind soul in the crowd. She held it tightly to her heart as the wood was stacked high around her, her gaze fixed steadily on the far horizon, as if she could already see the quiet garden of her father waiting for her just beyond the rising smoke. Imagine the slow, curling ascent of the smoke into the pale, vast blue of the morning sky. The flames rose not as a cruel enemy, but as a final, transformative heat, a sacred way to release the spirit from the heavy weight of the iron-bound world. Joan remained perfectly calm, her eyes gently closed, her spirit anchored in the same sacred stillness she had mastered years ago in the small church of Domrémy. There was no screaming, no bitterness, and no regret. Only a steady, fading breath as the physical world fell away. Her final word, spoken through the hazy, shimmering veil of the rising fire, was a soft, rhythmic whisper that seemed to echo across the square. Jesus! It was a word that carried all her love, all her history, and all her peace, drifting away with the white smoke into the vast, welcoming silence of the morning air. The fire eventually died down to a low glow, leaving behind only the gray, cooling ashes and a heavy reflective quiet that settled over the ancient rooftops of Rouen. But as the executioner looked upon the remains in the silence, he felt a sudden cold shiver of profound realization, a feeling that they had not extinguished a light, but had accidentally scattered it to the four winds. You can feel that same deep, melancholy peace now, a gentle and cooling release, as the story of the girl in the white armor reaches its earthly conclusion. The long struggle is over, the weight of the armor is gone, and the silence that remains in the marketplace is not empty, but full of the infinite. Joan's physical presence had vanished from the earth, but the echo of her life was already beginning to resonate through the very foundations of the world, growing louder, more rhythmic, and more beautiful with every passing heart. Take a deep, slow breath and let the image of the marketplace fade into a soft, indistinct blur of silver, lavender, and gray. The heat of the fire is long gone, replaced now by the cool, comforting pressure of the deep night air. You are safe in this state of total catharsis, held by the realization that nothing truly precious or holy is ever really lost. The fire died, the morning turned into a long evening, and the physical chains were left behind forever in the dust of history. But the story was not ending. It was simply transitioning into a new eternal rhythm, a celestial melody that would eventually find its way into the quiet dreams of every soul that seeks the courage to stand alone in the light of their own truth. 5 long centuries have passed since the smoke finally cleared from the square in Rouen, and yet the name of Joan of Arc has not faded into the shadows. It has become a permanent light in the heavens, It is a light that does not burn, but instead glows with the steady silver radiance of a distant, watching star, guiding weary travelers through the dark and tangled forests of their own lives. She has transitioned from a girl of flesh, bone, and wool into a universal symbol of courage that belongs to no single nation, no single church, and no single time. She's the patron saint of the quiet heart, the eternal guardian of those who choose to listen to the soft whispers of heaven, even when the world around them is loud with the clatter of steel and the shouts of men. Her legacy is a rhythmic, eternal heartbeat that reminds us that the most powerful force in the entire universe is not the brute strength of an army, but the unbreakable, quiet conviction of a single faithful soul. As you drift now into the final, deepest layers of your rest, imagine that Joan's great white silk banner is still rippling softly in the quiet, starlit corners of our collective dreams. It is no longer a banner of war or a signal for battle, but a banner of absolute, shimmering peace. Its golden lilies glowing like small, earthbound suns in the velvet dark of the night. She was not just a girl of France. She has truly become the hope of the whole world, an eternal reminder that the divine can choose the smallest, the humblest, and the most forgotten to carry the greatest light into the dark. You can feel her steady presence in the profound stillness of this very night, a gentle, watching grace that ensures the world is safe while you sleep. The mission is complete, the journey is whole, and the peace she fought so hard for is now yours to inhabit. The slow rhythms of Domrémy, the triumphant bells of Orleans, and the flickering torches of Reims have all merged into a singular, hypnotic hum, a grand lullaby of history that carries you gently toward the horizon of a deep and dreamless sleep. You are as rooted and as safe as the ancient oaks that once stood guard over her father's garden, tucked away safely beneath a heavy blanket of starlight that spans the long centuries. There is no more road left to travel tonight, and there are no more voices you need to follow. There is only the vast content silence of a promise perfectly kept. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the bed, becoming as light and as effortless as a single white feather caught in a warm evening updraft. Sleep now, under the same timeless and watchful stars that once looked over a quiet girl in a forgotten village. The same stars that guided her through the dark forests and the cold stone cells, and eventually the same stars that welcomed her home to the light. The banner is still, the fire is out, and the light is eternal. Sleep in the sacred stillness of the saints, and let the infinite peace of Joan of Arc be your own.